we'd like to open the floor up for some questions that you might have for our panelists. And don't be shy, because you're not a shy group, okay? And everybody in the room can ask questions. But let's start with our principals here, which are our great students from the Honors College. So come on, let's raise those hands and ask some questions. Don't be shy. I know you're not a shy group.
Remember, you're stuck with us forever.
Yeah. You got to make the choice carefully, right?
Your place to ask a question.
I have a question for Rex. So after, in your opinion, after we set up like our shacks and we start getting on our way, for the development of our society, you mentioned that we had this huge, well, it was actually rather small peak of specialists in advance of the, by far the main body of the society. To fix that, if you're rebuilding the civilization or society in general, is your idea kind of to reintegrate those small individuals like back into society and go for like a more gradual progress, more controlled, or to bring those individuals up to standard and to advance as fast as possible as a coherent society?
In the truest sense of my talking, as I did earlier, about transdisciplinarity, the first thing that we would have to take stock of in order for us to do any intelligent planning is what is the inventory of human resource available to us? Who among us knows what? Who among us can do what well? And what we want to do is try to devise a plan, a scheme, an approach that maximizes that human potential. We know we're probably going to end up dividing the tasks and the labor, and some of those will be practical things. But do we have a poet? Does anyone, who will attend to our spiritual needs? Who can, right? The earliest division of labor in the history of human society was when we set the priestly caste aside and said, you stay and tend to the spirits, right? Because the one thing that early human beings could not apprehend through the use of the five senses was why the life force ceased. We could see life being born. We could see children grow. And then the life force shows. And all of us, all of this is about love. We are bound together in a community of love. And if you've ever had the experience of someone who you love dying, it is a profound sense of confusion and love. And the persons who had the wisdom to help us explain that constitute the first form of social authority in the history of the world. And we set those folks aside and said, stay here by the sacred mounds and say the prayers, and we'll go gather the food and keep Professor Barry alive, because he's already and the community supported the religious caste. And we still do. The Internal Revenue Service Code of the United States of America makes priests, clergy, individual contractors that are supported by their communities. It's a very interesting notion. So we'd have to know who could do what. We'd have to decide on how we're going to do things. But everybody would have value. That's the whole point of the word commonwealth.
Another question. Oh, there we go.
This is through Dr. Barry.
Oh.
Yeah. Would you rather me stand?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, alright. I wasn't sure going to sit in the majority food. I took your class last semester, the 111, I think it was, UGC 111. And who would you, like, maybe not who, but what, like, how would you shape our new civilization? Like, based off of your experience with the history of, like, the culture of humans as a whole, right? Because, like, we have, like, the Greek civilization, the Roman civilization, and so on and so forth. And we've also, and you know the mistakes they've made, right? So, would you combine all of their ideas and come up with a perfect plan to
You have to do,
culturally?
I'm not sure how I can answer that. You have to do something like that. What you need to do when you're
you're constructing a new society is not repeat the mistakes that have been made, the millions of mistakes that have been made as far as possible, and to start from a synthesis of the best features of the world for the past 3,000 or 4,000 years, and start from that point. Use that as a basis, so there'd be synthetic analysis of what everything that had gone before that you'd use to start. And you have to do that right at the beginning, because otherwise you're going to screw up royally and do things that people have been doing wrong for thousands of years. You don't want to do that. So the function of those who know the past is to show the mistakes of the past and the process by which we can avoid those mistakes and create something much better than was there before. All right, so we have to understand that human society has a future. One of the problems that we have today, one of the serious problems, whether we're talking in religious terms or in social terms, popular culture terms, is there's no concept of the future. No real concept of a vital, expansive human future. Nobody has any such concept. It's a joke to think about the fact that we may actually exist in 300 years. You know, nobody has dared to think that far ahead, but we need to, we must. And whether we're in a, you know, never mind the nuclear holocaust, we need to do that now, and nobody is doing that now. That's the problem.
It's a question for all of you. Assuming each one of you had a seat in the raft, what discipline would you invite? What other discipline?
I'm shameless. You bring a colleague, okay?
Well, I'm assuming you're on the boat already, and you could choose one or the other for colleagues. Which would you recommend?
Yes.
I would answer that. I'll be crazy enough to answer that and say either English or classics. If thou hast but 2 pennies, with one buy bread, and with the other buy hyacinths for thy soul. We can't not have what those folks are talking about. And despite the pressing needs that are practical, there has to be a way to do that reflectively and in a way that elicits our very best inner selves. So I pick one, with much as I love her.
I guess I'd pick classics.
I would pick education, because I'm looking towards the future, and we have to think that eventually we're going to try and build a new culture. We're going to need to educate and start over towards that society. So education, I feel, is the way to the future.
I would choose my colleagues in the English department because we have great conversation.
You can sit at the top of the beach watching them work. I would actually choose my colleague from classics, if only to, by contrast, I would feel like an extremely resourceful and practical person. To know what it's like to be that kind of. When we had the October storm many, I guess, like 5 or 6 years ago or whatever, I was the only man on my street who did not have a chainsaw. Very inadequate. You know, so yeah, we'd have great conversations, and then, you know, I could beat him in an arm wrestle or something.
Besides possibly the practicality thing, like the ability to do the practical stuff, what would you say each of your biggest weaknesses are? In your field, what would you say your field's weakness would be? The biggest weakness that you would have?
I can tell you mine. Completely ignoring the modern world is, I suppose, a weakness. And since I never think about it, I'm sure I share that with most of my colleagues who would much rather think about something else than modern society. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you stop thinking about modern society, you might be far better off.
No, it's an interesting question, actually. In seriousness, I would go for our advantage is our comprehensiveness, you know, and the disadvantage is the tendency towards not having any specialization in particular areas. So I think those 2 things are both strengths.
In the Vitruvian paradigm, which Professor Berry alluded to earlier, 10 lamps on architecture by Vitruvius, the principal values articulated for design, in this particular case architectural design, are firmness, commodity, and delight. I think the field's shortcoming, the discipline's shortcoming, if anything, is a preoccupation in the contemporary era with delight to the exclusion of everything else. We've got colleagues in design who are so caught up in design that they can't think about anything else. And as an environmental designer and planner, I think that's a shortcoming. I think it's a real limitation that we don't, in fact, do that transdisciplinary work that I hold very dear. So we do have some limitations. I think we have something to offer, but I think there are very serious limitations. And I think that what we have to offer could be reflected in the following. I have some direct experience personally with immediate aftermaths of disaster. Anybody else got their hand up on that? Did we go tell jokes in Honduras? Offer them Beowulf? I went and helped rebuild a village that was named Faith, Hope, and Joy. The people chose that name. That was interesting, right? So, there are strengths and weaknesses, as Brett pointed out, with all of us.
I'd like to say we have no weakness, but I think that engineering as a whole maybe is a little too practical, that there is a little bit of a lack of that magic as a whole. But I'd like to believe that we could be creative people if given the opportunity, but it would be creative to constraints. So it would be a limited creativity. So maybe that's not true creativity. So I would say that's probably our weakness, if we had it.
And I would say for my discipline it would be the polar opposite of that, which would be a kind of tendency to, you know, a kind of to overdose on wonder and to sort of, you know, live the life of the mind to the extent that one cannot actually reach out into the world and interact with it. I mean, you know, Shelley, who I love, was one of these people who was just so kind of caught up in his poetic practice that, you know, he would frequently forget to eat or walk. He would misrecognize people who he'd known all his life. You know, he was just completely otherworldly to his absolute detriment. He loved boats and never learned to swim. That's a stupid thing to do. Right? So, yeah, a lack of practicality.
A lot of people you've mentioned I've noticed have drowned. So I feel I need to ask, can you swim?
Actually, no.
Interesting insight. Any other questions? Yes.
Given the nature of our relationship right now as you as the educators and us as students, how would you refrain from maybe taking on a superiority complex or becoming some sort of power-hungry totalitarian?
I would say that's my sole objective for coming on the train.
I don't know. No idea.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know either.
I can say as educators, we're always facing more complicated questions than we can solve. There's nothing as complicated as a classroom. If you think about all the things that sort of go on inside the classroom, all the things that are contextual to the classroom, and I think we are just kind of always dealing with a reality that's more complicated than we can wrap our heads around. So I don't think we would have a problem at all in that regard.
The concept of community is central to the heart of the planning. It's all we serve. So planners, if they were to try to operate top-down, would discover very quickly that that doesn't fly. It has to come that way. So we're the enabling tool, mechanism, through which the will of the community is enacted. Does that make sense? So it has to be, in some sense, we are thoroughly devoted to process, and that process works best when it's participatory. I actually ran an organization when I was a graduate student called the People's Workshop. and we offered free planning, consulting, planning, and design services to any legitimate community group that had a need and couldn't afford designers and planners. That's how we operate.